For most of human history, the universe was an unfathomable mystery run by capricious gods. Before the 6th century BCE, everything from the rising sun to the spread of disease was explained through mythos, stories of anthropomorphic deities pulling the strings of reality. Under this system, humanity was passive. When you believe storms and droughts are the literal wrath of angry immortals, there is no way to predict them, and no defense against the crushing weight of nature. You simply prayed, offered sacrifices, and hoped to survive. Then, in the coastal city of Miletus, a thinker named Thales proposed something radical. He suggested the universe actually operated on predictable natural laws, or logos. Looking at how ice melted and water evaporated, he theorized that a single physical substance, water, was the foundational building block of all existence. The scientific accuracy of his water theory mattered less than the method behind it. By removing divine intervention from the equation, Thales introduced the idea that nature could be observed, deduced, and understood by the human mind. This shift in perspective provided the framework that made all future scientific inquiry possible. This new rational approach immediately gave birth to the field of metaphysics, the study of realities-based structure. And almost immediately, early thinkers slammed into a massive logical wall, the problem of change. On one side of the debate was Heraclitus. He argued that reality is defined by constant flux and the endless tension between opposites. To him, existence was exactly like a river, always flowing, always shifting, meaning you could never step into the exact same reality twice. On the other side was Parmenides. He used pure deductive reasoning to argue that true reality must be completely permanent and indivisible. If something exists, it cannot suddenly not exist. Therefore, Parmenides concluded that motion and change are entirely deceptive illusions created by our flawed senses. Our eyes show us a world in motion, but raw logic points to a stationary universe. This unresolved paradox created an intellectual void. To figure out who was actually right, humanity had to build a more rigorous framework for testing and identifying the truth. By the 5th century BCE, the center of intellectual gravity had moved to the Athenian polis. Here, the scope of inquiry zoomed in. Thinkers stopped looking exclusively up at the stars and started examining the individual citizens walking the city streets. This shift was driven by Socrates. He left no writings behind, instead roaming the public squares armed with a method of relentless oral questioning. He systematically dismantled the assumed beliefs of anyone willing to talk to him. This technique, using the friction of cross-examination and debate to locate truth, stripped away false assumptions. It also had the side effect of publicly exposing the ignorance of powerful authorities. That public embarrassment came with a cost. The state eventually put Socrates on trial, charging him with impiety and corrupting the youth. They sentenced him to death by drinking poison hemlock. By accepting his execution rather than apologizing, Socrates established that reason and intellectual integrity sit above the power of the state. He proved that logic, not political authority, is the final judge of truth. The execution of Socrates deeply radicalized his student, Plato. Driven to find a standard for truth the state could not destroy, Plato set out to solve the old paradox of change and permanence. Plato argued that the physical world we see is merely a collection of temporary, imperfect shadows. True reality exists in a separate, eternal realm of perfect concepts, which he called the forms. But Plato's own star pupil, Aristotle, looked at this dual reality system and rejected it. He saw no evidence for a separate universe of perfect archetypes. Aristotle proposed a materialist counter-theory. He argued that form and matter are permanently linked together right here in the physical world. To find the truth of an object, you don't look to another dimension. You study its specific function, or ergon, in nature. Plato looked upward to abstract ideals, while Aristotle looked downward to observable facts. Their rivalry forged the two distinct lenses, Idealism and Empiricism, that continue to dictate how we debate the nature of reality today. While Athens debated, a synchronized intellectual awakening was happening globally. During this axial age, the transition from myth to rigorous inquiry erupted across multiple civilizations simultaneously. In India, intellectual friction emerged between deeply rooted traditions. Orthodox Vedic schools like Samkhya categorized reality strictly into unchangeable nature and plural persons. Meanwhile, heterodox movements like Buddhism challenged those rigid structures, offering new frameworks for understanding suffering and the self. Over in China, the intellectual explosion known as the 100 Schools of Thought took shape. Here, the primary philosophical battle centered on a practical debate over the correct way to structure human society. Central to this was Confucius. He argued that society could only achieve harmony through strict ethical codes, deep respect for tradition, and clearly defined behavioral structures where every individual knew their exact role. This rigid system was countered by Taoism. Taoist thinkers argued against forced societal rules, suggesting instead that humans should yield to the cosmos and align themselves with the natural, effortless flow of the universe. Across the Eastern world, the clash of opposing ideas moved from the mechanics of the stars to the mechanics of human behavior, refining the practical art of living together. Within just a few centuries, the human relationship with the unknown shifted. We moved from fearing the lightning strikes of angry gods to mapping the predictable rules of existence as active, rational investigators. To organize inquiry, it was divided into distinct branches. First, metaphysics investigates the fundamental nature of reality. Next, epistemology studies knowledge and how we acquire facts. Finally, ethics examines morality and how we ought to live. Together, these pillars support the framework of philosophy. These ancient categories of thought established the tools humanity still uses to navigate the modern world. By defining how to test evidence, to identify virtues, and structure logical arguments, these early thinkers built the foundational engine that eventually drove the scientific method and our modern systems of rights. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, the golden age of the independent Greek city-state died with him. In its place rose the Roman Empire, a sprawling, highly centralized political machine. The average citizen, who once had a direct voice in local assemblies, suddenly found themselves reduced to a tiny gear in an imposing, continent-spanning bureaucracy. The speed of the empire's expansion outpaced the citizen's ability to adapt. As history was dictated by forces far beyond local reach, people turned away from the state to look for a different kind of personal control. Debating the architecture of an ideal republic lost its utility when one could no longer influence even local magistrates. Thinkers needed immediate, practical tools for navigating a chaotic reality. When people lose the power to shape the external world, reason adapts by turning inward to master the mind. One of the first major survival frameworks came from the philosopher Epicurus. He argued that the universe was nothing more than random atoms colliding in a void, completely devoid of any divine order or celestial plan. If everything was left to chance, the goal of life became ataraxia, a state of tranquil peace. Often associated with indulgence, Epicureanism actually prescribed a quiet life of moderation, friendship, and the avoidance of physical pain. But the Stoics looked at the exact same world and concluded the opposite. The universe was a deeply ordered machine, governed by a strict, predetermined script. Because that script was already written, worrying about external events was seen as irrational. The only variable an individual actually controlled was their own emotional reaction to those events. This inward focus made Stoicism versatile. Epictetus, a man born into slavery who allegedly had his leg intentionally broken by his master, used these principles to endure physical torture while maintaining total mental composure. Decades later, Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful emperor on earth, relied on the same philosophy. While fighting military campaigns, he wrote his personal meditations to manage the psychological burden of absolute authority. Whether chained to a wall or sitting on a throne, ancient citizens survived Rome's turbulence by treating philosophy as a fortress for their own minds. Centuries later, the Roman Empire collapsed, and the map was redrawn by the rise of the Abrahamic faiths. For the next 1,000 years, monotheistic religion dominated life across Europe and the Middle East. This created a new problem for the intellect. If an all-knowing God had already delivered absolute truth through sacred scriptures, what use was human logic? The answer came from Islamic and Jewish scholars. Thinkers like Avicenna and Averroes salvaged the ancient logic of the Greeks and repurposed it to dissect complex theological mysteries. In the Jewish tradition, Moses Maimonides argued that reading scripture strictly literally led to a material understanding of God, a form of idolatry. To truly comprehend the divine, God required humans to use their intellect. Intellectual alignment with God's will became the new standard for human perfection, requiring a philosophical rigor that kept logical inquiry alive within the faith. In the 13th century, Dominican friar Thomas Aquinas argued rigorous logic and Christian faith act as complementary tools for accessing truth. Aquinas believed that because God created the natural world, observing the mechanics of that world through reason was another method of studying the Creator. He constructed the 5 ways, a series of arguments utilizing Aristotelian laws of cause and effect to intellectually demonstrate the existence of a first mover. For Aquinas and his contemporaries, human logic did not contradict divine revelation. Instead, it served to refine and clarify the nature of belief. The analytical frameworks built by these religious scholars didn't vanish when the Middle Ages ended. They formed the bedrock that eventually supported modern ethical theory and the scientific method. Historical shifts transform philosophy into an adaptive survival tool, where the methods of inquiry change alongside the structures of power. The ancient Stoics' inward quest for tranquility amidst a crumbling empire, and the medieval scholars' upward quest for divine understanding were both expressions of the same instinct. Empires fracture and dogmas change, but the human capacity to reason remains unbroken. For centuries, truth was not something you went out and discovered. It was handed down. In the medieval world, knowledge was treated as a top-down decree, issued by divine authority and preserved in rigid tradition. But by the 14th century, the rigid worldview began to crack. The Renaissance pulled Europe's gaze from the heavens, refocusing it on the physical world. Thinkers like Francesco Petrarch championed a new movement called Humanism. Instead of spending their lives preparing for the afterlife, humanists argued that people should cultivate their civic lives and tap into their own creative and intellectual potential. This renewed interest in human science and classical literature had an unintended side effect. By celebrating independent thought, the Renaissance actively eroded the unquestionable authority of the very institutions that had dictated truth for a millennium. This created a profound philosophical crisis. If humanity could no longer blindly rely on divine decrees or the old scholastic dogmas, how could anyone actually prove what was real? This cultural revival carried a steep intellectual price. By dismantling the old authorities, it left behind a terrifying vacuum of certainty. To avoid falling into total skepticism, humanity was going to have to rebuild its understanding of reality from the ground up. Enter the 17th century Age of Reason and French philosopher René Descartes. He took on a desperate, isolated mission to find just one single, undeniable truth. To do this, he employed a method of radical doubt. He systematically threw out every assumption he'd ever been taught. He doubted his education, he doubted his surroundings, even his own physical body, until he hit absolute bedrock. He was thinking, therefore he existed. I think, therefore I am. This breakthrough formed the core of rationalism, the belief that the human mind comes preloaded with innate ideas, making intellectual reason the only valid starting point for knowledge. Descartes, Spinoza, and Leibniz operated like intellectual architects, using rigorous deductive logic to map the universe entirely from within the mind. This mental framework deliberately bypassed human senses, which they believed were easily tricked. True reality could only be understood through pure logic. By sealing their theories inside this indestructible, mathematically perfect vault of human reasoning, the rationalist movement believed they had successfully rescued the concept of truth. But across the English Channel, a fierce intellectual rebellion was brewing. A new generation of thinkers completely rejected the rationalist claim that humanity is born with any built-in knowledge. John Locke emerged as the father of this opposing movement. He argued that human beings learn strictly through sensory experience. Locke proposed the concept of the tabula rasa, or blank slate. When we are born, our minds are entirely empty, waiting to be written on by the outside world. This is empiricism, the belief that knowledge is built from the bottom up, constructed entirely from physical data, observation, and lived experience. Berkeley pushed this further. If everything we know comes from perception, physical reality only exists because it is perceived by our senses. Then David Hume arrived and pushed empiricism to its breaking point. He demonstrated that if we strictly rely on what we can observe, we cannot logically prove invisible concepts, like cause and effect. We might see a cue ball hit an 8-ball, but we only assume the impact caused the movement. Empiricism successfully grounded philosophy in the messy, observable real world. But by enforcing such strict rules on what counted as evidence, it led thinkers right back to the edge of total skepticism. The early modern era didn't solve the crisis of certainty, but it permanently relocated the battleground for truth. The answers were no longer floating in the divine cosmos or hidden in ancient texts. They were now found entirely within the human mind and human experience. The rationalists' uncompromising reliance on logic laid the direct groundwork for modern mathematics and abstract theoretical frameworks. Meanwhile, the empiricists' strict demand for physical observation and data laid the direct groundwork for the modern scientific method. By debating whether the mind was a pre-programmed logic machine or a blank slate waiting for sensory data, these movements turned human consciousness into an object of study. This shift from the soul to the mechanics of thought provided the blueprints for modern psychology, cementing the self as an independent observer. Yet, the early modern period essentially ended in a stalemate. Neither side completely won the debate, leaving a lingering, unresolved tension between internal logic and external physical experience. By the late 1700s, thinkers were stuck in a bitter standoff over the nature of knowledge. Empiricists argued we are born as blank slates. Every truth we hold comes from sensory experience. On the other side, rationalists insisted that the senses were unreliable and that the universe could only be understood through pure deductive logic. Immanuel Kant proposed a solution that attempted to bridge this divide. He argued that while knowledge begins with experience, the mind is not a passive observer. It is an active participant that shapes everything we perceive. Kant believed the mind acts as a filter, preloaded with categories like space, time, and causality. When raw data passes through this mental grid, the mind organizes it into a cohesive reality. But this structure created a hard line. We only have access to the phenomenal world, reality as it appears through our mental filters. The noumenal world, the actual thing in itself, as it exists entirely apart from us, remains forever in the dark, beyond our reach. Kant had successfully defended objective truth, but he did so by trapping it. According to this model, we can understand the universe only because we are confined within the architecture of the human mind. G.W.F. Hegel took Kant's internal structures and expanded them to the scale of the entire world. He wanted to show that truth wasn't just found in the individual mind, but in the unfolding of human history itself. Hegel called this process the dialectic. History moves forward through a constant collision of opposites. When an established idea meets its opposing force, the conflict produces a synthesis, a new development. For Hegel, these collisions weren't random. They were the work of Geist, or absolute spirit, stacking upward through the centuries. He saw history as a rational climb toward a peak of perfect self-awareness and freedom. It was a towering, beautiful system. But for those in the 1800s, that glowing tower was shattered by the gritty chaos of the modern world. These systems were grand internal architectures, theoretical maps of a perfectly ordered universe. But they left little room for the messy, physical reality that was now consuming the streets. While philosophers spoke of the absolute spirit, the landscape of Europe was being rewritten in iron and coal. This was the Industrial Revolution, a world defined not by ideas, but by these dense layers of smoke and ash. As we pan across the faces of these coal miners, the gap between theory and reality becomes clear. For the new working class, existence was a matter of survival in dangerous, lightless tunnels, not a climb toward rational perfection. These workers weren't participants in a grand historical logic. In the eyes of the market, they were simply tools, physical components in a machine designed for production and profit. Abstract systems offered no relief for those starving in the shadows of the factories. Philosophy had reached its limit. It could explain the world, but it couldn't feed the people living in it. Karl Marx looked at this industrial landscape and decided that philosophy needed to be dragged out of the clouds. As his confrontational gaze suggests, he was interested in the material forces he saw right in front of him. Marx turned Hegel's logic on its head. In this inverted pyramid, the heavy base is made of material conditions, the way we produce food, clothes, and shelter. He argued that these economic realities dictate the shape of everything else, from laws to religions. This dialectical materialism reimagined history as a series of class struggles. It was a physical conflict between those who owned the factories and those whose labor was sold to keep them running. Marx redefined the purpose of philosophy. It was no longer enough to interpret the world through grand systems. The goal was now to change its material reality. While Marx focused on the struggle of the masses, his focus on economics left the individual behind. It didn't account for the internal psychological dread that comes with being human. Arthur Schopenhauer was among the first to voice this dread. His grim expression reflected a philosophy that rejected the idea of a purposeful, rational universe. Schopenhauer believed that life is driven by the will to life, a blind, irrational force. Like these dark vines choking a stone pillar, this will is a relentless drive that creates nothing but perpetual desire and suffering. In Denmark, Søren Kierkegaard reached a similar conclusion from a different angle. He warned that identifying with a crowd or a rigid logical system actually robs us of our individual freedom. Kierkegaard's solution was a total rejection of systemic logic. He argued that to find meaning, the individual must take a leap of faith, a terrifying, subjective decision made without the help of a safety net. By removing the comfort of historical designs, thinkers like Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard left the individual standing alone. We were now fully responsible for creating our own meaning in an indifferent universe. Friedrich Nietzsche targeted the very foundations of these crumbling systems, focusing his critique on the moral and religious structures that sustained European identity. Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead served as a terrifying diagnosis. He saw that Europe's traditional moral foundations had collapsed into nihilism, leaving the continent without a clear sense of purpose. Without the absolute truths of religion or the order of Hegelian logic, humanity was facing a crisis. We were looking into an abyss of meaninglessness. Nietzsche proposed a new figure to survive this crisis, the Übermensch, or Overman. This would be an individual who survives the death of absolute truth by forging their own values and imposing their own meaning onto the world. This was the arc of the 19th century. Humanity was evicted from the comforting certainty of grand rational systems and left in the dirt. At the start of the 20th century, European philosophers grew exhausted with the sprawling, often vague metaphysical systems of the 1800s. They wanted precision. They demanded undeniable, rock-solid facts. Physics and mathematics were making massive leaps, proving that reality could be codified. But as philosophers scrambled to catch up, the discipline violently split over how to actually lock down that absolute certainty. The academic world cleaved into two distinct camps. Thinkers in the English-speaking world anchored themselves to the strict, objective laws of logic. Across the English Channel in mainland Europe, they turned inward, plunging into the subjective, messy reality of human consciousness. This divide launched a desperate, decades-long race to construct a flawless philosophical mirror that could accurately reflect reality, a pursuit that would eventually shatter certainty entirely. The pursuit of strict logic found its champion in British philosopher Bertrand Russell. His goal was absolute clarity. He sought to strip away the ambiguities of everyday language and reduce all mathematics and philosophy down to pure, infallible logic. This analytical drive gained momentum in the 1920s with a group known as the Vienna Circle. They developed logical positivism, a strict standard declaring that any statement lacking direct empirical observation or formal logical proof is literally meaningless. Under this rule, debates about ethics, aesthetics, or theology were dismissed as mere noise. A young Austrian named Ludwig Wittgenstein took this approach to its extreme limit. He attempted to invent an ideal language, a framework where words acted as exact mathematical pictures of atomic facts in the physical world, leaving absolutely zero room for misunderstanding. Yet years later, Wittgenstein dismantled his own creation. He realized the fatal flaw in trying to lock reality into a rigid mathematical grid. People simply do not speak in logical equations. They play complex, overlapping linguistic games. He proposed that the meaning of a word is defined entirely by how it is used. A word acts as a tool, and its function shifts depending on the human behavior and social environment surrounding it. By admitting that language is fluid and deeply contextual, the analytic dream of building an objective cage for reality stalled. The search for absolute mathematical certainty in philosophy proved impossible. Meanwhile, mainland Europe was taking the exact opposite approach. The German philosopher Edmund Husserl founded phenomenology. Instead of trying to measure the external world, Husserl argued we should bracket it out entirely, focusing strictly on how human consciousness experiences objects. His student, Martin Heidegger, pushed this further. Heidegger introduced the concept of Dasein, or being in the world. He argued that we cannot separate ourselves from our environment to study it objectively. We exist within time, highly aware of our own mortality, which generates a persistent, unavoidable anxiety. This focus on existential dread quickly aligned with the physical reality of Europe. The sheer scale of destruction in World War II dismantled any lingering illusions of a rational, orderly universe. Cities lay in ruins, taking the idea of inherent safety or meaning down with them. Emerging from this fractured landscape, the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre popularized existentialism. Sartre inverted centuries of religious and philosophical tradition with a single premise: existence precedes essence. We are born into an indifferent universe first, possessing no pre-written destiny or built-in purpose. Without a predetermined path, every individual is entirely responsible for defining their own life through their actions. Sartre called this being condemned to be free. It is an immense, isolating burden, requiring us to invent our own moral compass from scratch. The continental effort to map a universal human consciousness led directly to the realization that reality is intrinsically chaotic. We are left completely alone to shoulder the weight of creating our own meaning. By the late 20th century, the ambitious projects of both philosophical camps had fractured. The analytic attempt to capture the world in perfect logic had succumbed to the messy reality of language, while the continental dive into consciousness ended in isolated subjectivity. From the wreckage of these absolute certainties, a new wave of French thinkers developed post-structuralism and postmodernism. Michel Foucault examined historical institutions, like prisons and asylums, to show that societal truth acts as a cultural construct. It is dictated entirely by the specific power structures and historical context of the era. Building on this instability, Jacques Derrida introduced deconstruction. He demonstrated that written texts and spoken language are highly unreliable, propped up by hidden assumptions and internal contradictions that unravel under close scrutiny. Postmodernism ultimately rejects all grand narratives. It argues that there is no single overarching theory of everything, no final unified explanation for history, science, or human nature.
Today's philosophical endeavor is the careful work of picking up these fragmented pieces: existentialist freedom, analytic precision, phenomenological focus, and turning them over in our hands. Modern thought has become an ongoing mosaic, challenging us to construct a new understanding of reality from the fractured remnants of our intellectual past.